So welcome everyone. We're so excited to have you here. I'm Professor Deborah Eisenberg from the University of Maryland Francis King Carey School of Law. I direct our law school's Center for Dispute Resolution and Dispute Resolution program. And I want to thank you for joining this webinar, What Works in Building a Restorative School District. In the next hour, our panelists will be highlighting lessons learned from recent empirical research about the effectiveness of restorative practices in schools. And importantly, we will provide you with some practical tips, examples, and resources from individuals who have successfully implemented restorative practices in various schools. This webinar is inspired and based on a new report published by the Open Society Institute Baltimore in partnership with the Law School's Center for Dispute Resolution. We will put a link in the chat to the report, which is rich with information as well as practical resources. So you will be getting that in the chat as well as in the follow-up email after the panel. So let me turn to introducing the panelists. In the interest of time, I'm not going to give you their full, very impressive biographies. That was in the Eventbrite. But let me give you a few highlights so you know who the folks are who are speaking with you today. So first we have Karen Weber. She is Director of Education and Youth Development at OSI Baltimore. And Karen has played a very central role in implementing and supporting the integration of restorative practices in Baltimore City Public Schools. And prior to her current role with OSI, Karen served as Executive Director of Student Support in Baltimore City Schools and also served as a transformational middle and high school teacher and principal and resident principal. Her work has led to dramatic reductions in student suspensions and expulsions and reform across the school district. Second, we have Matthew Hornbreck, who is in his 18th year as principal of Hampstead Hill Academy, the highest performing elementary and middle schools in Baltimore City, which, as you will hear, he credits in part to his use of restorative practices for more than a decade. I should also add that we are very proud that Matt is also an alumnus of Maryland Carey Law. And last but not least, we have Anastasia Stacy Smith. She is Director of Special Projects at the Center for Dispute Resolution at Maryland Carey Law. And Stacy has more than 15 years of experience providing conflict resolution, mediation, and restorative practices training and services throughout the state of Maryland. Stacy and I, along with the team, Karen and her team at OSI, were some of the principal authors of the new report published by OSI, and we'll be talking about that report today. I also want to thank Jennifer Kim from OSI Baltimore and Aisha Samples and Barbara Groeschel from CDRUM for all of their production assistance in behind the scenes in making this webinar happen. So before we begin the discussion with the panelists, we thought we would show you a very short 2-minute video, which provides an example of a community building restorative dialogue community building circle at Baybrook Elementary Middle School in Baltimore City. So this is an example that hopefully will provide a grounding before we get into the discussion.
Think about how you think you feel about going to first grade. How do you feel about going to first grade? Braylon, will you start us off?
You can feel,
No, how do you feel?
I feel happy.
Happy.
I feel happy. I'll feel worried. I feel happy. I feel good.
I feel
excited. I feel happy. I feel confused. I feel excited. I feel happy. I feel sad. I feel happy. I feel happy. I feel confused and worried. I feel excited. I feel scared. I feel cuckoo.
Oh, goof, goof. Okay.
I feel sad because I think there's going to be the same persons in first, like in kindergarten. I'm gonna feel a goofball.
Is that okay that everybody didn't feel the same?
No.
Some people say yes and some people say no. And one of the things we have to realize is that in no situation is everybody going to feel the same. And no matter how you feel, it's okay. But now I want to think about.
Okay, great. So that's an example of a restorative circle at a younger, for the younger grades. And I want to start off our conversation. Welcome for those who joined later. I just want to repeat, this is being recorded and you will get the link to the recording. If you have questions as we go along with our conversation, please type them in the chat to me or to one of the hosts, and we will integrate those questions as we go through the conversation with the panelists. First, I want to turn to Karen Weber, who has a lot of experience in restorative practices. And Karen, can you tell us a little bit more about what restorative practices are, why you think they are important, and how you have been involved in this movement to incorporate restorative practices in schools?
Thank you, Deb. I came into teaching through an alternative program. So initially, I'm a lawyer by training. I've been in city administration. I've been the head of a nonprofit, and then I landed in teaching and taught at Lake Clifton High School. What I really learned very quickly is that I didn't know the children in the room. I thought I knew, but I didn't really. And so for the first year, I just sort of fumbled my way through a teaching practice. That summer, though, I was lucky enough to be trained in restorative practice. In the following year, teaching and learning was happening, not just for the students, but for me as well. As we sat in circles and really developed a community. If you develop a community, everybody wants to learn, everybody wants to be there, and everyone wants to show up as their best self. And I mean teachers included. So the atmosphere changed in just a couple of months of using restorative practices. And what I decided that I had to do at that time is spread this as far and wide as I could. Soon thereafter, I became a principal through a turnaround program also, and embedded a restorative approach in my school as well. And once again, it created this sense of community. It created a place where everybody wanted to be. The same thing I tried to do when I went to North Avenue in student support. Dr. Alonso, who was the superintendent at the time, said to me, Karen, I want you to do whatever it is you did in your school. I want you to help other principals do that as well. Now, unbeknownst to me, Matt Hornbeck was doing this on his own in a separate universe, but luckily for Baltimore City. So in every job I've had, Deb, for maybe 14, 15 years now, my goal has been to spread the word about this it's a simple but very profound practice that can change lives. And it doesn't just change the children's lives, it changes the teachers' lives as well, and makes it very clear how meaningful the work that they are doing is for an entire community. So that's sort of like the short version of how I became involved in restorative practice. Oh, and Deb, if I could I just say a couple of words about the video as well?
Certainly, absolutely.
I wanted to let people know that there are many other videos embedded in links in the report. And that video is just a clip. One of the things I want people to process is that as the teacher is asking children how they feel, that's the least common question asked in a schoolhouse, no matter what the child's age is. You can go through entire school days, in fact, an entire school year, and never be asked, how do you feel or what do you think? And these are the questions that have to be in front of our children, because If for no other reason, when they reach a standardized test, the first thing they're going to be asked is to analyze, or what are your thoughts, or what are your opinions? And there's no practice for that happening in schools. But more importantly, we know that our children are growing up in environments that are incredibly stressful. And if you add economic low income status on top of that, plus the traumas that people are experiencing in our Baltimore City community, you have a recipe for disaster if you're not trying to relate to the children who are in your room. So I'll stop talking before I just go on a tangent.
You're a true believer from your experience, and we'll come back to your experiences. I want to turn to Stacy to give us a little bit of grounding about the new report from OSI and CDRUM, and what are the key findings in the report that you think educators on this webinar should know? And then we'll turn to Matt for some firsthand experience with restorative practices. But first, what is the empirical research telling us about restorative practices, and what should educators know about that empirical research? You have to unmute, Stacy.
My apologies. The report looked at three main things. First, it described how Maryland has made a shift to a learning approach to discipline in its law and policy, and that approach explicitly incorporates restorative practices. And it also notes that Baltimore City has made a commitment to restorative practices as a part of its blueprint for student success. And in 2016, City Schools announced that it had pledged to implement restorative practices in the daily work of all its schools and programs over a 5-year period. And finally, and most important for our discussion today, is the report examined the research conducted by Johns Hopkins University, looking at City Schools' intensive learning sites and a pilot project identifying 14 schools, and then put those results in the context of national research results. So what was the pilot? The pilot had 14 schools that were intensive learning sites. They received training and coaching. They received and developed an individualized implementation plan in collaboration with City Schools and OSI funded partners and community partners. And then they adopted and implemented a whole school approach to restorative practices. And the research looked at what happened after 1 year. And there were three really striking results in what happened after that first year of implementation. The first and most significant is that there was a 44% reduction in suspension and expulsions in the 14 pilot schools. It went from 804 total suspensions in a prior year to 450 in the examined year. And the suspension rate also per 100 students, that also dropped almost 6%. So that's striking and wonderful. And it's also consistent with what other schools and schools districts experience in the research and studies across the nation and in different kinds of school settings. So similar reductions were found in Denver, Minneapolis, Maine, Pittsburgh, Oakland. This is a common experience when schools adopt restorative practices and implement them with fidelity. Second, the Hopkins looked at and surveyed staff who responded to their survey after that first year of implementation and asked about school climate and what staff were experiencing and seeing. And a large majority reported that school climate had improved, and particularly that they perceived improvements between students and students, staff and students, and staff and staff. So building those relationships all throughout the building. That's also consistent with what schools experience nationally in using restorative practices to build school climate and improve it. And that makes sense because restorative practices are all based on, as Karen said, on relationships. And the third finding that was important was in that survey, they asked schools, what are your schools doing? And they identified that restorative practices were being implemented school-wide, and they had been fully adopted, and that it was well implemented in their school. Now that sounds minor, but a key aspect of implementation is, are we getting our message out? Do people know what we're doing? And have we integrated into the building? And the research there showed that yes, they had. That shows that they understood that school circles were integrated into schedules, that they were having meaningful daily circles, and that teachers had bought in. That's really good progress after 1 year of implementation, and it both points to success and where work still needs to be done. National research also shows that buy-in is essential and key to implementing restorative practices successfully, and it's a continued process. 3 to 5 years is the expectation around broad and successful implementation of restorative practices in a school. So that was really good news.
Great, thank you for that summary. And again, the report is really worth digging into for those of you who want more specifics. But I know a lot of the educators on the line really want real world example. And so Principal Hornback, tell us a little bit about how you went about implementing restorative practices in your school. You've had it a really long time. What difference has it made in your school, and what do you want the educators on the line to understand about that implementation process and the results you've been able to get from it? Oh, you have to unmute.
Thank you, Deb, and thank you, Stacy. That report is just mirrors our experience over these last 16 years, and I love doing this work with Karen Weber and Barbara Grochel and others. I'm sure on this call that I can't see. It has made a world of difference at Hampstead Hill. I do about 90 pre-COVID. I do about 90 tours a year myself, and parents say, "Why is everyone so happy? Why, what's going on here?" I think every school's mission statement has the word joy in it, and nobody knows how to create joy. Well, we know how to create joy. You need to make those connections that Stacy was talking about between students, between staff, and between staff and students. And the way you do that, and just like Karen said, it is not rocket science. It's fairly simple approach, is you have these restorative community circles. Now there are, a number of different ways to do this, but I think that the restorative practices approach is superior, and it is far more research-based and far more focused on outcomes. It's also something that I think every city council or central school district office or business or law school would benefit from. I think that this is not unique to schools, it's unique to humans. And if you think about what kids normally experience, and I don't know how old everyone is on this call, but I'll say, if you remember Charlie Brown's teacher, she didn't have a voice. She was an adult that just said, rah, 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 and that's what a lot of kids hear. That's what kids who are disadvantaged and advantaged, and it's just the way kids process what what adults are saying. Another thing that adults say is when something goes wrong, "Why'd you do that?" Well, what the heck is a kid supposed to do with "why'd you do that"? Because I made a horrible mistake and I don't realize what I'm doing? That's almost never the answer. And so restorative practices gives us a protocol. It gives us a way to connect with each other, to connect with kids. And we took, 16 years ago, one of my mentors brought restorative practices to me. And I had an initial reaction like, we're busy. We don't have time for that. And then that was the exact reaction that the teachers had. What would you like me not to do in order to do this thing you want me to do? And she, like I said, was a mentor, and we still have a great relationship, Dr. Muriel Berkeley. And she said, this is actually going to improve the work. And it may take an investment of time up front. It may take an investment of money up front, but your commitment is essential. And so she and I arranged to have all 100 staff members be trained off-site for 2 days. And we all dressed down in jeans, and we were trained by very strong people Steve Core and John Bailey and others. And we learned the fundamentals of building community with these circles. And then we came back and we did it. And it was not perfect that first year. And just like Stacy, I think it takes 3 to 5 years. But the office referrals, the detentions, and the suspensions, I couldn't believe the data. And we have a diversity and equity committee that looks closely at our data in terms of what's happening with, we're one of the most diverse schools in the region in terms of race, income, and language. And so we actually in our school can look at inequity in a way that lots of schools can't. And restorative practices is just a key piece of our success. And we're not just succeeding with white kids who are well off. We're succeeding with Hispanic kids and Black kids as well. And for example, the last year we took the assessment, our 3rd through 5th grade Black kids performed better than any other kids in the city, even some of the schools that are magnet schools. And a lot of the connections, regardless of race, income, and language, are because of restorative practices. And when you have such a mature implementation of it, we're able to even go further. And there's a program we have called Leaders Go Places. All 270 middle schoolers, and I'd love anyone on this call that would like to, either virtually, we're continuing them virtually, or when we eventually can be together again, to come to a Friday circle with our middle school, where the kids thank each other and their teachers for what happened that week. They apologize to each other and their teachers for what happened that week. And that's a result of thousands of circles that they've done over the years being here at school. And one of the things our alumni miss, and then I'll wrap up, is that sense of community and doing circles, because kids they know everything. They're thinking about everything, and they can't come to the work with a clear head unless you have a chance to check in. Kind of like Karen said, like, how do you feel? I see you. I know you. Or if you say something like, you can be in a circle with a bunch of 3rd graders, and at that age, they still don't really have segues. They'll be like, they'll just say, my cat died, or my grandma left for a trip or something, or someone's visiting. They'll just blurt out stuff. And instead of having that be kind of random and not connect with all kids, if you put them in a circle and they see each other and you say, I'm checking in, how are you? A kid could, might say, my parents had a fight. And that would be a good moment for the teacher to say, oh, that must have been hard. I'm going to talk to you about that later. And it's just a great point to refer kids to clinicians if needed. It's a great way to connect with them. And then we model this in faculty meetings. We do circles in faculty meetings. We do it with staff. We do it when we have Education Week open houses with parents. And if we were able to ask everyone on this call right now, name a club or sport you played in high school, we would know something about each other. We would make those connections. If we were in a room together, I'd wander over somebody who said I was on the tennis team and say I was too. I wasn't very good, but I was on the tennis team, and or I went to City College, or I did this or did that. We do that informally as adults all the time. This gives us the tools to do it with kids, and it definitely improves achievement. It definitely improves relationships. It improves teacher retention. We have 100 people give us a cold resume every year trying to teach here. And it's not because they know me or talk to me or that they think that we're a great school. They can look us up. It's because the word of mouth we've got and what they hear from other people. I mean, the best thing that you can have as a principal, you can walk by people that don't know you're the principal with little kids on a playground nearby, and you can say, where are you going to send your kid to school? And they say, oh, well, Hampstead Hill's a good school. You should check it out. Being a good school is shorthand. If parents are going to give you the most important thing in their life for 7 hours and 5 minutes a day, then you better have something that you can nurture and hold all of what it means to work with a kid that's ages 4 to 14. So I would encourage anyone to, I think my contact information is going to be posted at some point, and please call or email. There it goes. Aisha's on it, man. If anybody would like to talk in detail about this, about my experience, or if you want me to talk to another school about why they ought to consider it, and principal buy-in is key, like Deb was saying, and Stacy was saying, and Karen was saying, that it's key. So thank you for inviting me today.
Great. Well, I'll circle back to you in a bit, but I wanted just to invite Karen to build on what Matt said, any other observations? And I noticed that something that Matt was really focusing on is that sense of proactive community building. And so any follow-up comments about what Matt said?
Sure, thank you, Deb. One of the things that can be problematic with implementation is that people think of restorative practices as an alternative to suspensions. That's not the design of restorative practices. It's not just to be trotted out when there's a conflict, because the truth of the matter is, unless people are practiced in the skill of communicating to one another, a restorative circle after a huge fight occurred is really not going to solve anything. And so we found that to be incredibly ineffective. And Stacy spoke about whole school implementation. And basically to break that down, what that means is using circles to build community first and foremost. 80% of your time should be spent in circles that are constructive. Thereafter, when conflict arises, and I know Matt has this happening all the time, the kids run up to you and say, you know, there's something that's about to happen. We're going to need a circle. They ask for the circle themselves. So that's when you sort of flip discipline on its head. It's no longer this sort of dark thing that sits in a corner somewhere. It's integrated into the way we communicate to one another in a schoolhouse. The last thing I wanted to say too is that restorative practices is the best way to engage students in their learning. It's not a set aside, it's not separate and apart. Yes, you may start with a circle that's just checking in terms of how people are feeling, but when you also learn the children's interests, you can follow up with readings, with discussions, with rich information that is relevant to them. There's another gentleman, and Matt and I have worked with him before, the Teacher of the Year, Mr. O'Rourke. He's an English teacher. And one of the things his children had difficulty doing is explaining what restorative practices are, because they didn't see it as anything different from the lesson. It's so integrated into how he teaches that it's one and the same. So I really also encourage folks, Hampstead Hill, there are at least 2 videos of Hampstead Hill and a restorative circle in our package that we're going to send to you. And I really encourage you to take a look and see what you think.
May I follow up with a quick comment? Karen, that's absolutely right. We do a lot of restorative conferences. And when you switch from these restorative circles and community building to a restorative conference because something's gone wrong, someone's been mean or hurtful, and we ask 3 questions. And they're simple questions, just like the circle. What happened? Who was affected? And what do you need to move on? And I was just blown away by the last question, because kids, if you just give it a pause, give some wait time, what do you need to move on? They just want to be heard. They want an apology, and there might not be one, but they want to say they want an apology, or they want their locker moved, or they want to sit somewhere else in lunch, or they don't want their parent called, and sometimes we have to, but if you can solve this kind of conflict and not have it build over months and years, you just see wonderful things in the school. And so those restorative conferences are a key piece of the work.
Sounds like a culture of proactive community problem solving that everyone gets comfortable with. And before I turn to Stacy about additional lessons from the research, I'm just curious, Matt, in this age of remote school, where everyone is, we're politically polarized. There are deep conversations about racial justice going on. What is that looking like in your elementary and middle school? How are restorative practices being used in this trying time of 2020? What does it look like right now?
Well, like I mentioned, we have a diversity and equity committee, and the middle school in particular is very open and engaging, talking about Black Lives Matters issues, about racial injustice, about if the Breonna Taylor verdict comes down, and that's on the minds of parents, it's on the minds of kids as well, especially in middle school, and it's something that needs to be discussed with kids. And our teachers are you know, on a continuum of being ready to discuss those things with kids or to facilitate a discussion, but they're doing it. We're doing circles every day with kids, and they're check-in, and unfortunately the power of actually sitting in a circle isn't possible in gallery view or speaker view. And so that, you know, it is what it is on that front. But we have 250 kids at the middle school community circle on Fridays. That's voluntary. It's not part of their mandatory time to log in. They are craving that time. We actually are only doing thank yous during that time instead of apologies. And the kids are just so grateful to each other and to their teachers for all this work. Everyone is anxious. Everyone's on some continuum of being depressed. And we've got little kids bursting out into tears and parents saying, I don't know what's going on. Well, they're feeling this, something's wrong. It's just not right. And this is like restorative. I feel like our school is more equipped than most, and that the 56 schools in the study are more equipped than most to deal with what's going on right now, because this is all about disconnection and restorative practice is all about connection. And so if you've got a little foundation and base to make that happen, then you've just got, you're ahead of the game, because you know someone sees you and they care about you. And it's much easier, but it's very difficult. And I should say that just two quick examples, Deb. Two of the moments when restorative practices made a very big difference in the life of our school. One was the day that schools reopened after the unrest around the murder of Freddie Gray. And that was very, very challenging and an emotional period. And we hit pause on everything, and all 29 homerooms circled up, and we talked and we checked in. And the kids, you know, even down in kindergarten, they knew what was going on, and it was intense. And we really we were able to process together, and we were able to not just say, open your book and let's take attendance and learn how to read in the 5 minutes we're back together. Now it enabled us to get to a place where we could more quickly get together and get focused on academics. But we find that work is critical. And then the other example I'll give is there was extreme worry with good reason after the 2016 election among our Hispanic community. We had dozens and dozens of our 325 Hispanic kids, especially, but white and black kids as well, come in the day after the election and be very, very upset. I mean, just it's no secret that Baltimore is a very blue city, and they're very progressive and liberal city. And the parent conversations and the challenges around that election, we had to circle up again and again. It helped, and we had clinicians and social workers and psychologists sit in on the circles. And it was a godsend. I mean, it really helped us quite a bit write our work and support our families. And both of those moments were foundational, were essential in realizing that the foundational work we're doing around restorative practices is key. And so there are a lot of missteps that all schools make in the first months and years. And I would just encourage anyone that's engaging in this work to stick with it. We actually have a full-time director of restorative practices on staff who is all about staff wellness as well as student wellness. And it really is if you can even be that committed to it, that you're putting budget behind it and a position behind it, you even get more out of it. So that's not necessary. It's not part of the base implementation plan, and you can do it basically for no money. If you know the simple protocol, but it does take commitment and work. Thank you.
So 2 questions for you, Stacy. One is, anything else from the research that folks on the call should know in terms of best practices for implementation? I know the report is very deep in that regard, so maybe just 1 or 2 key points, and then also getting questions from some of the law students that are on the line with us about how law students can get involved in this work. So I don't know if you want to take that question, or I can speak to it when you're done.
Maybe some of both. So a couple things on implementation. the research is showing that, the work is most fertile when some pre-work, where you've prepared the ground to lay out the practices. So I think of it as pre-implementation, those honest and tough assessments about where your school is right now. Do your existing school values align with restorative values? Do your policies and approach to discipline align with what a restorative approach to discipline would be around behavior management, around building relationships, and about student engagement? Are we ready as a school to really listen to students and to empower them? The second thing is, Matt said it, and it can't be said enough, is leadership is essential. Leaders have to set the stage, they have to create the vision, and they have to literally make time and space for restorative practices to take place. So when can circles happen in that school schedule? Where will conferences occur? Who will support the teacher while they're in a conference? Who will get trained? How will resources happen? You have to both be a cheerleader, and then you have to create that accountability processes so that staff know that this is what we're doing and who we're going to be. And then that issue of support, staff need it. This is tough work to keep the momentum and the high quality, high fidelity to it. So you want the coaching, you want professional learning groups. And Matt also mentioned it, modeling. A favorite phrase of mine in a faculty room was, if you don't model what you teach, you're teaching something else, right? So staff need to behave restoratively with each other. And the more you can integrate it fully throughout the program, throughout the school, the more successful you'll be. And also, research also supports the more broadly integrated a program is into daily and regular activities, the less disruptive it is in the end. And schools are more able to accept it and incorporate it equally. On the law schools, I'm glad that they're interested. I think that two things that come to mind is the mediation clinic does a lot of work and work in schools and has on at least exposing students to restorative practices. We've worked in schools for as long as we've had a schools program. And then the Levitas initiative on sexual assault theory and restorative justice. And that's another class that they can explore. And you probably have a lot of other things you can suggest to them.
Well, I would just say for the law students on the call, come talk to me and we'll get you involved if this is an area that you're interested in. There are lots of classes and other ways to get involved. But I want to turn back to Karen because we are getting a question about how restorative practices look at the high school level. And I know you have experience in that regard, and I know we have people from all over the state. But high school, you take the smaller communities and then they may get dispersed into different communities. I think this is pretty pronounced in Baltimore City, but it may be the case in other places as well. But speak a little bit about restorative practices in high schools, and then if you have any other follow-up on implementation advice for different schools.
What's funny, Deb, is that the folks who work in high schools think this would never work with little kids. And the folks who work with smaller children say this could never work in high schools. And it works so well in high schools. In fact, one of the reasons that I focused on the video of little 5-year-olds in a circle is that I couldn't imagine it from my experience. But as a secondary educator, restorative practices was a natural. Especially, again, if you infuse it with your teaching practice, and if you happen to be in the humanities, there are so many things happening in their own communities that are topical, that need to be discussed in the way that Matt spoke of, and giving them space and freedom to have those discussions breeds amazing results. And it isn't just, oh, everyone feels good. Everyone learns better. I mean, that at the end of the day, we want to prepare, especially in high school, we want to prepare them for their lives. And this is the beginning of so doing. So I think it's a natural place for restorative practices is with the older kids. But I have been shown wrong that it's for all kids from 4 up. and that's the good news.
And what about the resources that are available? I know the report is rich with resources, and I'll start with you, Karen, and then I'll ask you, Matt, what's been really helpful for you, and then circle back to Stacy for anything that hasn't been mentioned. So what about resources, Karen? What's available for educators who want to implement this either in their own classrooms or try to take it to their whole school or their whole district?
Sure. We chocked it full of as many resources as we could either create or get our hands on. One of the things that we developed with 2 teachers from Baltimore City is a resource that is full of lesson plans and circle starters. For the average school, there's not enough money to support teachers with coaching and training all year long. The average school will get hopefully 2 days of training, and then they're told, good luck. Well, we know that that's not how things get implemented, because especially if you're in a stressful circumstance with all of these different requirements being put on you, you default to what you know. But if you're trained and then you're handed a book of recipes for how to use a circle, you're much more likely to get folks to give it a try and to really buy in, and then come up with their own creativity as to how to make it work in their classroom. We also have the videos that I spoke of, and we have a video guide. So we ask open-ended questions about each of the videos. And one thing that Matt touched on that is critically important: when you hear something in a circle, as the adult in the circle, that is troubling, you circle back with that child. This is your roadmap to see where students really are. And you'll know who is struggling academically, but more importantly, you'll know who's struggling socially or emotionally. And you can double back with them and then connect them to resources. And you can't do that when you stand in front of 35 children and just speak. One last thing I want to say, though, which is a little bit of a tangent, is that one of the hardest things that I saw and I have seen throughout different school settings, one of the hardest things for teachers is to give up control. And you really have to. When you sit in a circle with a group of children, you're one of the members of the circle. And that doesn't mean that, if folks start cutting up or acting, whatever, that doesn't mean that you have absolutely no control. You're still an adult, but you're not standing over children. You're not telling them to raise their hand. You're not forcing them to speak when they don't want to speak. It's a real community activity, and it takes some time for folks to make that transition.
I was really struck by that in the video, how the teacher made sure that every student had a voice, and then normalized at the end that people may have different opinions. And I was struck in reviewing the research that restorative practices has had, there's been evidence of reducing bullying and sort of accepting difference. And I think that little 2-minute segment showed some of that. So Matt, what about other helpful tips for educators who want to implement this in their schools? What would you suggest in terms of resources for them, or ways to get started, or to kind of take their programs to the next level?
Yeah, I think that you want to try to get a meeting with a principal, and could be a guidance counselor, could be another leader in the building, like ask the principal for whoever his or her right-hand person is, and see whether you can get that in front of them, or a superintendent, or the head of the nonprofit, or the head of the conflict resolution department, whatever it is. But you definitely need to be thinking about it systemically. Now that is a bummer if you're a teacher, because you're like, my principal doesn't want to do it, or I've had 5 principals in 6 years. So where does that leave me? You can still do this work. You can still study the work. It's not rocket science. It's also not just touchy-feely. Teachers were like, I'm not going to, you want me to hold a kid's hand who's just done something bad, and you're not going to suspend them, and you want to keep your suspension numbers low because that's what you get yelled at for? No, that's not the way that this works. I'm doing it so that you and the kid will enjoy each other and respect each other and listen to each other and learn from each other, and that you can get through the content you need to get through during the school day. And so you can do it in an individual classroom, and people, when an implementation, quote unquote, fails from a fidelity perspective, you often see, I'm sure, and Stacy could maybe attest to this, little satellite sprinkling of quality implementation in classrooms, because it becomes second nature to teachers to just do that. They become stellar teachers in an awful school for many decades. And that, unfortunately, there's good teachers in every school, no matter whether the principal is turned over or not. And there's terrible teachers in a lot of schools, not just in the city, but all over. And you could be a much better teacher. Even mediocre content people can be way, way more effective if they would take some of this mindfulness practices work, some of this restorative practices work, and really put it into place. I can say that we had an early lesson learned was a teacher came down and she was very upset, very animated, very upset. She said, I can't do this. And I said, well, what happened? And she said, I had him in a circle and I asked him a question and it just didn't work. I can't do it. I can only teach. And she was old school, right? She was like, silence meant that things were good. Well, now we know that's not true. Kids need to have student-to-student academic talk. They need to connect throughout the day, and they can't just sit there silent. And no one is doing anything. If when Karen was a principal and for me, if the kids are only quote unquote good when they're in proximity to the principal or to their favorite teacher, but the new teacher or the sub or when they go out after school, they're just aren't exhibiting any of the maturity that you hope to instill in them from an emotional perspective, and that's one thing restorative practices does, then you're not doing any, that teacher with that high control isn't doing what he or she thinks that they're doing. And so this teacher came down, she was upset, and I said, well, what question did you ask? And she said, I asked them to name one thing they didn't like about me. And well, this group of fifth graders let her have it. And she was very upset about that. So it matters the question you ask. That's obviously the wrong question. And it could be, community building circles we gave teachers for years, our social worker and clinicians gave them circle starters. And we keep circle logs so that teachers write down the questions they ask kids. And for years, we would write down, did anyone skip? Did anyone say pass? Because we wanted everyone to eventually feel comfortable sharing and going, taking a turn speaking. And so there are problems that you have to work through, but remaining committed to it will really mean good things.
So Stacey, picking up on that theme, and what about the challenges to implementing this? Any lessons from the research about how to overcome some of those challenges and resources that folks can use?
One of the challenges is that maintaining that commitment and recognizing that it's not a one and done on 1 year of attention and then it'll just go on by itself. So you really have to keep the ball rolling and keep bringing attention to it. There's some challenge to financial resources to support the work. Matt's so fortunate to have a full-time staff person dedicated as their restorative coordinator. And in some studies, that's been shown to be really helpful, but that's not everyone's situation. And what Matt has said is true, is that you can do this in your classroom, you can do it in your guidance counseling room, and you can start to spread the work. But if you really want that big impact, it's that whole school where everyone is on board and supporting each other. So maintaining those professional learning groups where teachers are supported and can bring their challenges to each other to troubleshoot, that's been shown to be really helpful to maintaining fidelity and momentum on doing it.
Deb, I just wanted to say something just quickly, just to applaud Baltimore City Public Schools for taking this on. It wasn't easy. It was very messy. Everybody was not of an accord. What helped us a ton, though, was to have 2 stellar schools that have been practicing long-term that could show the results. And one of those schools is represented right here by Matt Hornbeck. The average district that starts off doesn't have someone right on site who's been doing this for 8, 10, 15 years and who has results to show. And that was really, really important in our advocacy. So I just wanted to put that out there. The district did a yeoman's task.
And we had Dr. Santelises come when she was chief academic officer and visit circles and look at what we were doing. And so I think having model site close by is a great thing. And then I think when teachers talk to teachers or principals talk to principals, good things happen. So just doing that, whether it's in your same district or, in another city or state.
And Deb, I don't want to take us too far off track, but I just also wanted to say that this practice has international implications as well. That other countries are also employing restorative practices, and that I have international colleagues in Open Society Institute who have come and toured Matt's school from as far off as Kenya, South Africa, England, and so forth, and felt like this is magic. This is something we can do. It's accessible. It helps students to feel belonging rather than othering.
And Karen, you're doing work around Healing City as well. And boy, does that have its roots in restorative practices. And so just right here in Baltimore with Mayor-elect Scott and others, I know very interested in that work.
Yes, we want to drive this train as far as we can, the restorative train.
Yeah, and it sounds like that concept of healing is something that's going to be important as we emerge from this pandemic and reconnect with those in-person connections. So a last question, and then I'll invite each of the panelists to give any closing thoughts in our last 5 minutes. But I'll just throw this open. I'm not sure who wants to speak to it. Maybe you, Karen. But some folks have expressed concerns about what about students have restorative practices at the elementary or the middle school level, and then they go to a middle school or high school that doesn't have restorative practices. So do you have any thoughts on that kind of problem? And then we'll get to final thoughts.
Deb, that's one of the reasons that when we were pushing and advocating for the school system to adopt this practice, that we weren't doing it by grade band. We want the entire district to adopt this practice so that when I leave Matt's school and go to high school, I'm being treated the same way and I have the same expectations. I have the same voice that I had when I was at Matt's school. And I know Matt can speak to this very specifically about the students who do go on to other high schools and don't have the practice to bolster them.
Yeah, I think that the challenge is kids, it's a tension in elementary and middle school, how you create the executive functioning and independence that's necessary to, instead of going to 3 or 4 classes, go to 7 or 9 classes over a massive building that's 4 times larger than any building you've ever been in, with a bunch of people who don't know you. And that the turnover here, we're lucky in Baltimore, there's lots of K-8 schools, and we're pre-K-8. So we've got kids from ages 4 to 14 for 10 years. That's a lot of time to build a relationship. But in high schools, you got 25% of the kids are new every single year. And that is not as much time, but they're older, and it's a very rewarding experience. I think when I talk to my high school colleagues, I think it's more difficult in high schools because the faculty is often in large high schools not as connected as they are in the elementary or middle schools, and it's more like a mini community college approach. I think restorative practices belongs in community colleges as well. But I think that high schools are not doing as well as elementary and middle schools in building relationships on the whole. Baltimore has some very small, intimate, and very personalized high school programs, but the large high schools have a challenge with that. And our kids come back and report that. They want to come. We have an alumni event every year, and we had one online this year. And they come back and they're like, I miss you guys. And all you have to do is say why. And they say, nobody knows me. or I haven't found my people yet. And so that's and it's what's great is they stay connected. If you're from Baltimore, people don't ask you where you went to college; they ask you where you went to high school. And in some ways, that we feel like we're going to flip that even further and say, where'd you go to elementary or middle school? Because we have kids, who are now in their late 20s, who were kids when I started here, who still stop by. And it's really, though, the benefits in the last 7, 8, 9, 10 years, kids who had circles for 5, 6, 7, 8 years of their experience here that really are the ones who miss it and benefit most from it.
Yeah, that sense of connection, you can tell it's strong. So I do see we're out of time. We did get a question about are there the empirical evidence from the report. So there is in the chat a PDF that has links to the report, and we will be sending out an email probably in the next day that has an evaluation of this program, as well as links to the report and a lot of other resources. Oh, Aisha has put it again fresh in the chat. And so we invite you to reach out. This is obviously a really important, and I think that folks need more than just an hour to get all of the information they need. So I just want to invite anyone on this webinar to reach out to any of us if you have follow-up questions. But I will, real quick, 30 seconds, Stacy, if you have any last minute words, and then Karen, I'll let you have the last word.
I would just think sometimes in this work, it's not a lack of resources, it's an overwhelming amount of resources. So look at the report, click on a link, watch a video, and connect with one of us and to get some direction about if you want to start.
I just wanted to say that it's really time for us to think out of the box and not think that 1950s style education is appropriate for 2020. And also to reward principals like Matt Hornbeck, who he's not every principal, but to reward them by letting them have pre-K to 12 schools and letting them have more say over what's happening in schools. Why are we experimenting with children? If we know what works, why aren't we replicating that everywhere we go? We just have to do that.
Yeah, I think there's an emerging recognition, not just at each district level, but also at the state level with the changes in the law, and MSDE is rolling out a collaborative to provide more support for schools as well. So so hopefully this means we're moving in the right direction. I want to thank especially the educators who joined us for yet another Zoom call today. You all are just amazing. We really appreciate what you're doing with our kids right now. And with taking the time to learn about restorative practices. We hope we have the chance to get to know you and support you in that journey as you move forward. And sadly, we need to end. I know there's so much more to say, but thank you all for joining. And hopefully this is the beginning of a conversation that we can continue to support each other as we move forward. So thank you very much.